Okay. All right, so I am recording. Okay, so in terms of, I guess initial questions, just kind of any housekeeping questions or anything like that, guys, that you might have. Let me know. I did, make a few updates in terms of kind of like headings and stuff like that, and some due dates. So things should be semi-accurate up until probably going through the next unit. Just a heads up, after we take, so the exam is Wednesday. Hopefully everyone knows that. Remember, you must have your camera on the whole time you're taking an exam. If your camera goes off, I'm gonna have to, give you guys a 0 for the exam. Okay, so there's no excuses for that. I have to make sure that I'm holding you guys accountable. So cameras need to be on for the exam. Make sure we're logging in on time for that exam, and then basically you guys are just going to go onto Moodle. I'll tell you the password and start the exam. Okay, so it'll take that exam period, or I'll set the time for an hour and a half, whatever is appropriate. Okay. Any questions, I guess, while I'm on that topic about just kind of like logistics of the exam or anything like that, or even just setup of the exam? I think we already kind of went through that. Okay. As questions come up as we review, please ask. So like I said, I kind of went through and made updates. So next week on Monday, we will start talking about the group project, okay, which will be a poster. So you'll have a choice of making it sort of like a patient information poster or more of like a research focused poster, but it will be on a disease. So start thinking about what disease you would want to do for that project, and also who you might want to work with in your group. Groups of 2 or 3, no more than that. Okay, so you can start thinking about that. We'll talk about that on Monday. All right, for now, just worry about your exam. The other thing, we're starting unit 2 essentially this week. So after the exam, or by Thursday or Friday, I'll have chapter 5, the chapter 5 recording posted. Okay, I haven't really been worried about getting it up before the exam because I'm assuming everyone's focusing on studying for the exam. Okay, so I expect that you guys will listen to that recording before coming to class on Monday. All right, so that's us kind of moving in, chapter 5, chapter 6. And then I do have exam 2 scheduled for that week of the 28th, if you guys see here. Okay, and I'll let you know what day, and we'll figure that out. If it has to be pushed back a week, that's fine, but that's kind of the way it's scheduled right now. So we're only covering 5, 6, and then chapter 8 from unit 3. Okay. If that changes, I'll let you know, but that's what I, basically could cover last year. So I've kind of stuck with those chapters that we had time to cover. Okay. So there's definitely going to sometimes be chapters that I might leave off, or I may just cover parts of it. You'll see, I think for chapter 5 and 6, I may not cover every single thing that's in the textbook. Okay. All right, guys, any questions about any of that? Again, sort of like logistics or due dates or anything, everything for chapters 1 through 4, and also that not case study, the assignment on the COVID and host genetics that was due on Friday. Everything, that pertains to chapters 1 through 4 is due. And right now we're focusing on studying and taking the exam on Wednesday. Any questions? No, we're all good right now? Okay. All right. Oh, so I have a question. So how did you guys feel about that classroom that we were in last week? Oh, you were fine with that? All right. All right, let me know if, okay. All right, so moving, we should be going back to our schedule next week. I was trying to get us moved into a better classroom, so I'll let you guys know about that if that's going to be the case. But otherwise, we'll be back in there for Wednesday next week. Okay, but I'll send you guys an email to remind you, my sort of reminder email that I usually send out on Fridays. All right, so what we're gonna do, I'm gonna pull up what I did in my last class is I kind of pulled up the review sheet, gave you guys a chance just to kind of ask any initial questions or anything that you want me to particularly go over. And then we went through and we basically did practice questions. Okay. And then obviously any questions that came up through there, that's the way we did the review. So I told you guys to come prepared with questions. So anything that you guys have, obviously I will answer. Okay. So let's start off. If you guys just take a look, remember chapter 1, my review sheet was pretty sparse, right? Because I had you guys that was one of the first things we did to just kind of fill in some of that terminology, right? You guys did that. I think we kind of did it in groups or whatever. So I don't know, is there anything in particular from chapter 1 that you feel like you need a little more clarification on? No? All right. So what I'll do is I'm going to do a couple review questions. I'm going to probably only do like, I don't know, 6-ish of them and then move on to the next chapter so that we don't run out of time. Okay. So let me do that. It's probably, let's see. Okay, so I'm going to go with, and I may kind of like flip back and forth, but I'm going to use for review these NCLEX style questions. So remember that, again, if you paid for the MyLab, you should have access to this yourself. So there are more questions than we will do. Also, there are other questions in the module assignments. And then remember the review questions too. I put up those PDFs with those review questions on there. I think, there's usually only a couple for each chapter. So if you have questions about what the answers are for those, you can kind of shoot me an email or let me know, but those are in the back of the book. Okay. So let's go with these. And we just go from there. So if we're in chapter 1. So there are 20 questions, I believe, for each chapter here. I'm not going to go through all 20. We'll run out of time, okay? All right. So what do you guys think the answer is here? Somebody unmute and shout out an answer.
Would be balance.
Who else agrees with balance? Right, so remember there was this table in chapter 1 that talked about like main concepts and then sub concepts, right? And then like diseases related to the concepts. This is kind of where this is coming from. So I would agree. I would choose balance. Okay, so yes, that's the correct answer. Remember, it always gives you the rationale here to explain why that's the correct answer. If somebody has a question and wants me to elaborate further, let me know, right? Stop me. Otherwise, I'll kind of move on. There's certain ones that I may elaborate on anyway, but these sort of straightforward ones, I'll probably kind of go through kind of quickly, just so that we don't run out of time, okay? All right, next question. All right, what do you guys think here? What are we going to choose for that one?
Would it be illness?
I like that answer. What do you guys think? Who else thinks illness? We agree? Or does anyone have another answer?
I agree.
All right. So let's see if it's right. Correct. Right? Remember that the term illness, right, is used to describe the individual's experience with the disease. So again, I kind of said for chapter 1, it's about knowing the terminology, right? But it's the questions, there might be a few that are straightforward, kind of like defined, but for the most part, I'm not going to say, the following or which of the following is a definition of illness. It's being able to apply, right? So you know what it means. You can answer a question that's related to it. And this is an example of one of those. Okay. Okay. So what do we mean when we say somebody's lethargic? What's another word for that?
I feel sleepy.
Yeah, tired, right? Fatigue, whatever. Okay, good. All right. So now this is a straightforward question, right? So what's the answer here?
A.
Agreed. A, right? Collective group of signs and symptoms that are a result of a disease are referred to as a syndrome, okay? So this is giving you an example here, a client with carpal tunnel syndrome. Okay, some of the signs, numbness, tingling, weakness. All right, anywho, moving on. Like I said, I don't want to spend too much time on chapter 1 because I think it's pretty straightforward. What do you guys think here? Risk factor.
Would it be obesity?
Who else agrees with obesity? Or shake your head, yeah? I would probably choose obesity. I mean, all of these are opposites, right? Kind of, So one of the answer choices, was insulin sensitivity, right? What's the opposite, I guess, of insulin sensitivity and something that's related to type 2 diabetes? It's in the explanation there.
Well, they don't produce insulin when you have diabetes.
Not for type 2 necessarily. So sometimes there's a decrease in production, but most of the time type 2 diabetes is caused by something called insulin resistance, meaning you produce insulin, but the insulin's not able to bind to its receptor and bring glucose into the cell. So it's not about a problem with production. It's a problem with the way the insulin is functioning. Basically, it isn't able to function to bring glucose into the cell. So that's what we mean by resistance. So insulin sensitivity is the opposite, right? That would suggest that insulin is working really well, right? That it's extra, there's more receptors around, it's able to bind to its receptor, and it's able to pull glucose into the cell. So remember, the function of insulin is to bring glucose from the blood into the cell. Why does the body want to do that, guys? Isn't it good just to have glucose just floating, circulating through the blood? Or why does insulin need to be brought into the cell? What do you think? What would glucose do circulating around in the bloodstream? Does it have any action there? The answer is no, right? I mean, remember we talked about, again, when we're talking about pathophysiology and really understanding the basis of disease, right? And how things are happening, it's on the cellular level, right? So glucose has to get into the cell. Why? The body breaks down, or the cell breaks down glucose for what?
Is
Energy?
it energy?
So if glucose never gets into the cell, there's no way for the cells to produce energy, right? If the cells can't produce energy, there's a whole bunch of metabolic reactions that can occur. And then that starts having effects, on the tissue and on the organ level. Okay? All right. Any other questions about that, guys? All right, next question. What do you think here? Non-modifiable risk factor.
D.
Do we all agree that it's D, right? So again, understanding the difference between a non-modifiable risk factor and a modifiable risk factor, right? All the other 3 choices are modifiable. Having a father, with coronary heart disease, there's nothing you can do about that. Hopefully that's the right answer. It is. Yuki, we'll probably get to 10 questions, guys, and then we'll be off onto chapter 2, okay? All right, here's lethargic again. Okay, which is considered a symptom?
Lethargy. Oh, no.
Well, yeah.
Sharp lower quadrant abdominal pain.
Yeah, I agree, right? So it's kind of like a tricky question because you could say lethargy definitely could be a symptom, right? But it's saying here that the nurse charts that the client appears lethargic, right? So she's observing that. So that in that case, we're considering it a sign, right? So do we all agree that the correct answer is probably B? The nurse can't feel that pain, right? That's a symptom. That's subjective to the patient. All right, good. But see, so be careful. So this kind of a word of caution, right? Make sure you read those questions carefully. Now, usually I don't try to purposely trick you, but sometimes, or like on like the NCLEX exam and stuff like that, and any other certification exam, sometimes they do try to trick you, right? They make sure you're really taking, being careful to read that question in its entirety, right? And look for all those clues that you can. So just be careful. All right. So what's the answer to this guy?
C, diabetes mellitus.
Yep, C, type 1. Okay, so we just talked about type 2 diabetes, right, before? So now what about type 1 diabetes? How is it different than type 2? What's happening here? Might as well close the loop here. What's happening in type 1 diabetes?
You can't make insulin, or you don't make enough insulin.
Yeah, so you can't make insulin, and usually it's because there's an autoimmune sort of attack on those cells that produce insulin. So in this case, in type 1, right, your body's not able to produce insulin, right? And usually it's diagnosed at a much younger, it's diagnosed at a young age. All right, cool. Oh, let's make sure it's the right answer. It is. All right. So like I said, we'll go to 10 and then we'll stop at chapter 1. Okay, guys? What do we got here?
Maybe B.
D.
Okay, so either B or D. So when a disease is in remission.
Oh, never mind. I realized now.
Yeah, see, be careful though, right? Because make sure you, I did it actually with my other class on a couple of questions. I was like, oops, I didn't read that right? Right, so be careful. So what do you guys think it is? D?
D.
D. Exacerbation, if I could say it correctly. Try to say it 10 times fast. All right. Okay, what do we think? What do we think this is?
Iatrogenic.
Good. How would you define iatrogenic? What does that mean?
It's like unintentional, so it's like medical error or like treatment and stuff, so it's not really intentional from the place.
Yep. Good. What's idiopathic? How would you define that? Somebody else.
No unknown, like there's no known cause.
Yep. Good. All right. So last one we'll do here for chapter 1. What do you think for this one? This is, again, just a definition, right?
D.
I'll go with D. Yeah, right? So study of groups of genes, okay? All right, are you guys all okay with me moving on to chapter 2? Again, I just wanna make sure we have enough time, right? Okay, so let's close that off. Let's take a look at the review sheet here. Ooh, that's not the review sheet. Okay, so chapter 2, right? That's our genetics chapter. A little bit of basic biology in the beginning, okay? And then chromosomal abnormalities, we talked about that, some different chromosomal disorders, understanding the difference between autosomal recessive and autosomal dominant diseases, okay? All right, I'll ask you one question before we start. What's a SNP? How would you describe that? What is that, or define it?
Aren't those mutations that appear in like, oh gosh, 1% of the population?
Yeah, the idea is that they're going to occur in 1% or more of the population, right? And yeah, it's just a single, like a point mutation, right? But in a specific region or in a specific gene, right? So the idea is if you're always seeing this, or if you're seeing this genetic change in a higher percentage of the population, it may indicate that this could then be associated with disease. And there's been a lot of SNPs, right, that have been associated with disease. All right, good. Okay, so the idea is it's still a mutation, but it's going to occur in a higher percentage of the population. All right. Anything from chapter 2 that you guys have questions about, or anything that you want me to specifically clarify before we go over the questions?
Can you go over the autosomal recessive and dominant disorders and stuff like that?
In terms of how they're inherited?
Yes.
Okay.
As
All right.
well as like the chromosomal abnormalities.
Okay. So any other questions for chapter 2? Okay. So I guess I'll pull up, the best way to probably go about this is to probably pull up the PowerPoint. I just feel like I gotta have something, I can write it out on the whiteboard, but I feel like it's gonna take too long. So let me just pull out, it'd be good if I can find the lecture. I had chapter 4 ready, I didn't have chapter 2 ready. All right. So why doesn't somebody tell me, how would you describe, as I'm pulling this up, how would you describe an autosomal recessive disease? What does that mean? In terms of who has it, I guess, in terms of what genotype would have that disease, if you're talking about autosomal recessive.
Like all lowercase letters, like lowercase c, lowercase c.
Correct. And what do we call that genotype?
Homozygous
Yeah, homozygous what?
recessive.
Right, homozygous recessive. So it's only correct. So if we're talking about an autosomal recessive disease, homozygous recessive, those genotypes will be the patients that are affected by the disease or that will have the disease, meaning you have to have 2 copies of the diseased allele, right? So what do we mean by allele? Oh my goodness, can you open up here? I'll probably just write in some things here. Well, actually, I think I already did that. Oh no, I did that in the, so know that in the recording, I do go through and like write things in the text box and explain this a little bit more and show a Punnett square. So if you just looked at the PowerPoints, make sure you go to the recording. Again, I don't want to spend too much time and then run out of time for other questions. So, oh, I have it in here anyway. Okay, so perfect. Okay, so again, if we're talking about single gene disorders here. So autosomal recessive, right? A patient with this genotype will have the disease. Again, if we talk about the genotypes, right? This is one allele, this is another allele, right? These, and we say alleles, okay? We're talking about different versions of that gene, okay? Whether it's a normal version, big C, or the diseased version, okay? Meaning your body is producing an abnormal protein or something like that, right? And remember that one allele comes from your father, one allele comes from your mother, yes? So if we're talking about autosomal recessive, the patients that have that disease, what happened to my mouse? Have to have this genotype, okay? What do we call this? Carrier, okay? So this patient does not have the disease, but they carry one copy of the diseased allele, okay? Here, homozygous dominant does not have the disease. They also are not a carrier, okay? All right, can I move on? Who I forget who asked that question. Are we okay with that? Any other questions? Okay, then you have to be able to, from here, be able to do a Punnett square to say what percentage of offspring, right? Or what's the chance of having an offspring that has the disease? Remember, you have to go that step further, okay?
So that would be on the, like a question that we have to make a Punnett square to get the percentage?
Correct.
Okay.
Okay. So I go through that example here, and here it is here. So based on this example that I did right here, these are 2 carriers. You guys agree? What are they? Yeah. What percentage of offspring, or what's the chance of having an offspring that has the disease?
25%.
25%, or 1 out of 4. Okay. If you change up these genotypes here, you should be able to also figure out what the chance is. Okay. If you move on and you talk about autosomal dominant, oh, did I not give you an example of that? Oh, I think I kind of like went from, so let's just do it this way. So if we're talking about an autosomal dominant disease, right, of these genotypes here, okay, which genotypes have the disease if it's an autosomal dominant?
Big C, little c.
And who else? 1 second, my phone's ringing. Hey. Who else has the disease?
Little c, little c.
Autosomal dominant. So now in this case, if we say the disease is autosomal dominant, that means the big C, the dominant allele, is the diseased allele. The recessive allele, the small c, sorry, I don't know why my mouse keeps doing that. The small c is the normal allele. Okay, so heterozygous, yes, has the disease, but also who else? Big C, homozygous dominant. What is the normal, which genotype is normal and does not have the disease? What do you call this?
Homozygous recessive.
Correct. Okay. Are we all right with that? If you now look at my Punnett square example, and I told you that this is an autosomal dominant disease, here are your parents, right? So in this case, they would both have the disease, but they both have 1 normal allele. So 2 heterozygotes. Here's the possible offspring. What is the chance of having an offspring with this autosomal dominant disease?
75%.
Yes. Why do you say 75%?
Because 3/4 of their offspring would have big C, which is the dominant allele. So then, even if they have little c, they're gonna express the disease.
Good. So as long as you have 1 copy of the big C, which is the diseased allele, you will express the disease. Good. The only genotype that will not express the disease is the homozygous recessive. So correct. It's a 75% chance. Okay. Other questions? All right. If you're talking about, I think our chromosomal, yeah. If you're talking about chromosomal abnormalities, we're not focusing on one specific gene, right? Therefore, we're not going to talk about genotypes like we just did. Those, when we're talking about those specific genotypes, we're focusing on one specific gene, saying, here's your diseased allele, here's your normal allele. When you talk about a chromosomal abnormality, it's going to be many genes that are affected, right? Because if we talk about 1 chromosome, there's many genes on that chromosome. So if you have an extra chromosome 21, you have a whole bunch of extra copies of genes. Okay, so normally, again, when you, let's go to here, right? You guys look at these karyotypes. Okay, this is 1 chromosome, this is the other. So when we were just talking about those alleles, okay, we say basically you get 1 chromosome from your mother, 1 chromosome from your father. Those specific alleles or those specific genes, we were talking about 1 very tiny specific spot on this chromosome, right? 1 specific gene. However, this chromosome is made up of many genes, right? So like in the case of Down syndrome, or if you want to look here, XXX syndrome, right? You have an entire extra X chromosome. So that means you're going to have an extra allele essentially for all of these genes that are present on this chromosome. Okay. So when you talk about chromosomal abnormalities, there's many genes that are affected. Okay. And there's not that many examples Why? If you're missing like a whole chromosome, it's going to have such serious effects that most likely it's not going to be a viable embryo, probably even. Might not even make it to the fetus stage. You know what I mean? So a lot of times there aren't many examples of autosomal sort of chromosomal abnormalities. Okay, there are more examples of chromosomal abnormalities that affect the sex chromosomes because those are more tolerable. Okay, so when you talk about autosomes, you're talking about chromosomes 1 through 22, right? And then you have obviously the sex chromosomes here, right? X and Y. Okay, other questions, guys?
For the karyotype example, should we be able to know like what it looks like for someone with Down syndrome or like what that karyotype would look like?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if I showed you one and said, is this normal or what does this patient have? Yeah, we should be able to pick that out. I mean,
Okay.
to be honest, yeah, the only one we really talked about that, was Down syndrome. And a little bit, I think, like I mentioned Klinefelter's and stuff like, and I think maybe one other one, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So if it doesn't look normal, put it that way, yeah? So if you don't have 2 copies of every single chromosome, right, then there's something wrong. Other questions, guys? No? Okay, so let me minimize this and then go back to some of the questions, okay? All right. Why is it taking so long to, sorry, wait, I did make it bigger. I don't know what happened. Oh, there we go. All right, guys, what do you think about this question here? What's the answer? What are you guys going to choose as the answer here?
Is it B?
Why did you choose B? So read it carefully.
Is it C, genes?
Yeah, so be careful, right? I could see why you may kind of be inclined to choose B because you saw protein, right? But it says, what are the segments of DNA that code for the production of certain protein? So remember, segments of DNA are the gene, right? So if you think about one gene, it's going to ultimately code for a protein, right? So what you have to be careful of is that it's saying, what are the segments of the DNA? Okay, genes, right? DNA, we just looked at those chromosomes, that's DNA, right? Remember, there's multiple genes on it, okay? So the answer is genes. But again, I could see how you might quickly kind of look at that question and say, oh, proteins, I know amino acids make up proteins, but it's asking you about the segments of DNA, okay? Does anyone have a question, more of a question about that? You're all right with that answer? You see why it's not B? Okay. All right. What are the pyridamine bases called? Which ones are the pyridamines? Remember we talked about, or I talked about purines and pyridamine. So if you think about all the nucleotide bases, right? You have guanine, cytosine, thymine, right? And adenine. So which 2 are the pyridamines and which 2 are the purines?
Adenine and guanine are purine, and cytosine and thymine are pyridamine.
Be careful because a purine always pairs with a pyridamine, right? But I think he got it right. Would you say it again?
Adenine and guanine are purines, and then cytosine and cytosine and thymine are I can't say it.
You got it. Pyridamines. Yeah. So be careful because some people you may be inclined to think, oh, A and T pair together, those must be right. So, but it's a purine always pairs with a pyridamine. So that's correct. Thymine and cytosine are the protamines, right? Adenine and guanine are the purines. All right. All right, what do you think about this one? This kind of pertains to a case study that we went over. I think it was one of the ones that was assigned to you in chapter 2. Yeah. I like this word too.
Epigenetic.
Yeah. When in doubt, if it's an answer choice, probably should choose it. No, yeah, epigenetic, right? Because remember, it was what were they talking about in that case study? Anyone remember?
How
What
she didn't want her child to get her like allergies or whatever, I think it was.
And then correct. And then she was thinking about like taking fish oil, remember? Right? Okay. And remember that, you know, there are chemicals and external agents that can cause epigenetic changes, right? That ultimately then can have effects on the body. Okay. Next question. All right, what do you think about this?
B.
I agree. I would choose B, right? BRCA genes. Okay, so if you test positive for that gene mutation, you are at an increased risk for developing breast cancer. That doesn't mean you're going to develop breast cancer, but it puts you at an increased risk. Okay. Oh, next question, please. Okay. So this is probably not a question I would ask you guys. I think it's a little bit beyond the scope of this class, especially as a nursing major. But I don't know. What do you take a gander at this? So if you're looking at it, you're like, what? Then don't worry about it. But what do you think? I definitely don't talk about these a lot because I think, again, it's beyond the scope of this class. Somebody take a guess.
Would it be RNA interference?
I like that guess. Yeah. So RNA interference is where basically there's these strands of RNA, but also other molecules that are involved as well. And their job really is to like silence genes, right? And to turn things off. So if that process wasn't functioning, you would have an increase, right? And so that's what this is saying, a cell type producing an unexpected protein. So meaning that that gene should normally be silenced by these RNAs, but if it's not functioning right, then that protein would be made. Okay. Again, am I going to ask you about RNAs? No. Okay. So don't worry. All right. Okay. So the same thing. This is another question that I really didn't go over this in too much detail. So I wouldn't ask you this question either. Okay, guys. So like if there's something that I don't go over and that I didn't explain in the recorded lectures, I wouldn't ask you that question. So does anyone know what the answer is here though? So it says, how long do the diploid cells in the female ovary remain in prophase 1? So this is meaning like meiosis hasn't even really started yet. It's in the very first stage of meiosis. Does anyone know what the answer is? Take a guess.
B.
B, yeah.
So somebody in my other class guessed the same thing, but that's not the right answer. What's another guess?
Would it be D?
Like I said, I'm not going to ask you about this because we didn't focus on oogenesis and talking about every single detail about it. It's actually A. So, but there's also a state or part of oogenesis where it gets halted again later on, and then once it's fertilized, it then continues the rest of the process. So that's why most people will choose B. But if you're talking about the first step, it's not going to proceed or start meiosis really until puberty. Okay. But then, like I said, there's another stage where it gets halted, and then once it's fertilized, it continues. All right, so again, something not to worry about. All right, what do we got here? Reading a gene. So again, be careful. We're talking about gene, which is DNA. Okay, so what would you guys choose for this? You're going from DNA to RNA. What's that process?
Transcription.
Transcription. Okay, so you wouldn't want to choose translation, right? Because again, it's saying reading a gene. However, if you're thinking about like the end all being, you know, a protein being made, you kind of think of transcription and translation both being in there. So if I asked you something kind of along those lines in terms of understanding what transcription and translation is, I would provide some more detail and make it more clear, okay? But again, because it's saying reading a gene, this is talking about DNA, right? What's the process from DNA to get to that next step? So what happens in translation, guys? Probably tells you there. What are we doing in translation? What happens in translation? You're going from what to what? From DNA to protein in translation?
RNA to protein.
Yeah, RNA to protein. Thanks. Okay, what do you guys think about this one? What's your answer?
A.
I agree. Very good. Right, so what happens as a result of that? So again, that one amino acid change, right, leads to misfolding of the hemoglobin, right? And basically causes those red blood cells to become misshapen, and they lose their, well, they don't lose their ability completely, but they lose efficiency in terms of carrying oxygen around, right? All right. Okay, so you may say, what the heck's Prader-Willi syndrome? She never said anything about that. So that's probably true. I don't think we really talked about it. You could quickly, if somebody wants to kind of quickly look it up. So again, if I'm going to throw out, especially for all of these, actually it's probably worth me saying this right now. For these genetic diseases, I gave some specific examples. So those that I gave specific examples about, like Down syndrome and things like that, we should know what they are, right? But there's also other examples, right? So like I wouldn't just throw a syndrome or a disease out there and not give you some more information, right? So I may say, all right, this disease is an autosomal dominant disease, or it occurs as a result of loss of a segment of chromosome 15. I would give you guys some more information to be able to then answer it, right? Because again, it's not about memorizing those diseases, it's about understanding the concept, right? Well, what does it mean, if you're autosomal recessive? Who cares if you forget that Huntington's is autosomal dominant, right? That's not what it's about. You would forget tomorrow anyway, so if you memorized it, right? So anyway, just know that I don't expect you guys, or you don't have to worry about, memorizing kind of like exactly what a disease is. I'll usually give you that information and ask you questions about understanding what it means, okay? So what do you guys think about this? Anyone look it up quickly, and what'd you find out? So what causes Prader-Willi syndrome? Is it a single gene mutation? Or is it a chromosomal abnormality? Did you find out?
Chromosomal abnormality.
Yeah, of which
because of chromosome number 15.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's basically like a deletion of a part of chromosome 15. And what about kind of its inheritance in terms of, right, whether it comes from the father or the mother? What else do you find out?
It says it's passed down by the father.
Correct. Yeah, it's passed down by the father. All right. So what response would you choose here?
B.
It does present, actually, if it's if that same sort of I guess defect is sort of passed on from the mother, it actually results in a different disease. So yeah, I would probably choose B. So one of my students in the other class said, well, why I wouldn't choose B because the nurse shouldn't say that, but meaning that like it should come from a genetics counselor or something like that. But the point is she was already diagnosed with that, right? So that the idea is that, you know, you're counseling that patient, right? After that diagnosis. And so you're trying to help them understand it. So completely fine to give some facts, right? And help them understand it. Other questions about that, guys? Okay. A couple more here. I think. Yeah. What do you guys think about this one? So some clinical manifestations of a child with trisomy 21 or Down syndrome. Which one should we click? Should we click B? And there was a slide, right, that had a picture of a young girl with Down syndrome, and it had some of the physical characteristics, some of the cognitive characteristics, and then there was another category. What do you think? Should we click A, long attention span?
Mhm.
What about B?
Mm-hmm.
What about C?
Yes.
What about D, cautious behavior?
Yes.
So they have the exact opposite, right? Impulsive behavior. And what about E? Want to click cognitive impairment? They have cognitive issues. Okay, so we should be familiar with some of the clinical manifestation of Down syndrome because that was one of the diseases that I talked about in more detail. Okay. All right. We'll probably end on this one. I thought I had one more. I might do one more because I'm thinking of there's one more, a couple more questions that I was hoping we got to. What do you guys think about this? What are you guys going to choose for this one?
I would pick D.
I agree. D, right? So whenever you're talking about a chromosomal abnormality, like an extra chromosome or a missing chromosome, it's due to non-disjunction during meiosis, okay? When those gametes are produced. All right. Okay, well, this is the last one probably. A woman is meeting with a nurse and shares that she would like to get pregnant. The nurse notes that the client has Marfan syndrome. So first, like I told you, I probably would say, all right, Marfan syndrome is an autosomal, what? Is it dominant or recessive disorder? It is one of the ones I think I gave an example of, but which one? Autosomal dominant or recessive, guys?
Is it autosomal recessive?
Marfan? What do you think?
Wasn't it dominant?
Did somebody look it up? What'd you find? I don't know what slide. Oh, I have a PowerPoint right here. I believe. Wrong one. What do you think? Which one? Dominant or
Dominant.
recessive? What'd you say?
Dominant?
Yeah. So let's see if I have that in here. Right. So I gave you some examples down here. Again, on the exam, I would put in parentheses, it's autosomal dominant. Okay. Again, it's not about memorizing. However, these are definitely, I did give you a couple examples. So, all right. So what are you guys going to put for this then? Now, don't you need another piece of information here, guys? Now, you don't really if you look at the answer choices, but say this was like an open-ended question, right? Do you guys agree that you need another piece of information? And what is that?
They don't say if the husband is like a carrier.
Well, this is an autosomal dominant disease. So if you don't have the disease, there's only one genotype you could be. So for the husband, what's the only genotype he could be?
Little c, little c.
Correct. Oh, look, I can write, maybe. Where's my writing thing? Oh, here. Little c, oh, I did the wrong one. Little c, that's for the husband. But for the mother, right? She has Marfan syndrome, but it's autosomal dominant. So is there only one genotype that she can be, or are there two possibilities?
Two.
Yeah, so she could either be big C, little c. I should be using M's, right? Or she could be what? Homozygous dominant. Do you guys agree? Now, if you look at the answer choices, what do you think the answer is? You don't really need to do the Punnett square. What do you think the answer is, even if we didn't do the Punnett square?
50.
Does it matter if you're male or female for an autosomal dominant disease? Does it have anything to do with the sex chromosomes or anything?
Doesn't it depend if it's, this might be something else, but doesn't it depend if it's on the X chromosome? Then
Yeah, but it's not, right?
is it likely to get it?
It's not. It's an autosomal dominant. What does it mean to be autosomal?
Right. So
Right?
it's not X chromosomes.
Correct. So it's not. So okay. So we know the husband has to be little c, right? All right. So let's just do it two ways. So anyway, again, without even doing this, what would you guys choose as your answer? If it doesn't matter if it's male or female, which one's the only one that doesn't have anything to do with male or female? Answer choice.
50%.
Yeah. Okay. So if we went like this and we said, okay, these are supposed to be little c's, but they don't really look like that. But anyway, we went like this and we said, all right, the genotype of the mom is heterozygous, right? We're going to fill in big C, little c here, big C, little c here, big C, little c here, and little c, little c. So in this case, what would be the chance here? Did I do that wrong? Yeah. This is supposed to be a little c here. So yeah, so in this case, sorry guys. Right, this is a little c. Let me do this like this. Let's not use c's. You can't tell what the heck is what. Let's just do this just so that I complete this here. Right? The father, two little m's. You guys agree? He doesn't have the disease. Yes? Don't use c's. That's the worst thing to use. Okay, so what am I filling in here? Big M, little m, right? Here is little m, here. And then over here is little m. So based on this, what do you get?
50.
50%, right? But if her genotype was two big M's, which it could be, you would get what? So say we change this to a big M, what would it then be in terms of the offspring that are affected?
100%.
100%. Correct. Okay, so I would probably give you, if I gave you a question like this, I would give you answer choices that said 25% of the children, 50%, or 100%. I would also tell you all of the information that you needed to know, okay? I probably wouldn't give you answer choices like this, but again, you don't even have to do the Punnett square. You just have to recognize that it has nothing to do with the sex chromosomes. It's an autosomal dominant disorder, right? So the only answer choice that it could be here would be this one, right? 50%. All right. Okay, guys, I want to get out of chapter 2 here. And you can, here's another one, right? Where it's saying there's 2 carriers. You can draw out the Punnett square. Why don't you guys take a look at that and just, and do it and tell me what you think the answer is. And then we're undone that one. Okay, so these are 2 carriers, 2 heterozygotes. And I believe it's the same exact example I have in the PowerPoint. Oh, but what is it asking you? It's saying we'll inherit 2 mutated genes. Yeah. So anyway, it's asking who has the disease. What's your answer here, guys?
Would it be 25%?
It would be 25%. This is the only one that has 2 little c's that would be affected, 1 out of 4. Okay, it's the same example as I gave before. Oh wait, sorry. Let me erase this. All right, I'm going to move out of chapter 2 and move on to chapter 3. Any more questions in chapter 2? No? All right, we got it right, thank God. Okay. All right, so if we go on to chapter 3, okay, remember this is the chapter on environmental influences of disease, right? And remember, I told you guys this before, to make sure you take a look at the case studies because there are so many different types of environmental exposures. Again, we can't go through every specific example, right? But the case studies give you some specific examples, okay? So on the exam, I'll definitely pull one of those case studies from chapter 3. Again, I'm not gonna ask you the same questions. I'm not gonna probably give you the entire case study, but I'll give you a part of it and ask you a question about that as one of the essays. So remember, there will probably be about 4 essays on the exam, okay? There may not be an essay question from chapter 1, I don't know, but probably 4 in total, okay? And so usually, well, in terms of what they'll be worth, probably those 4 essay questions will be worth about 30 or 40 points of the exam, okay? Again, I have to weight those heavier because everyone's gonna have their notes, right? And so, anyway, make sure you pay attention to kind of what the point values are. Don't spend all your time on the multiple choice, okay? You can't, you won't have time to finish the essays, and it's purposely designed that way, okay? So if you think you don't have to study because you haven't opened notes, don't do that, okay? Questions, guys, about that? All right, so remember, understand concepts, don't worry about memorizing. You have access to your notes, so you can just quickly be like, oh crap, I forget what that is. That's fine. But if you don't study at all and don't know the broad concepts, that's when you're gonna have a little bit of trouble, okay?
Is it going to allow us to, like, say we want to do the essays first and then, okay.
Yeah, you can. So make sure and I'll warn you guys of this, when you go onto your exam, make sure there's something that you click. It's either in the top left or the top right that shows you that navigation window, okay? And it'll show you all the questions and you can kind of click on the questions. If you skipped one, you can go back and you can see everything there. Make sure you do that. Yep, you can go any order you want. All right, any questions for chapter 3, sort of right off the bat? All right, so let's do some, what do I do now? Oh, here. Oh, other thing to remind you, remember there is a tutor available now for our class, okay? A student that took my class last year. So I'm not gonna set up group tutoring sessions like because there's not enough interest in that, But with that said, just put in a request to the Academic Success Center. If there's a couple of you that want to work together, you can just put that in your request. Okay. So really whatever you guys need, put in the request to the Academic Success Center and they can set you guys up. All right. I just wanted to remind you guys of that too. All right. What do you guys think about this?
A.
Everyone agree, A? Yep. Questions about that? All right. Now, this is something that I talk about and we just should know. Now, you may be able to kind of reason through this, but I feel like there's probably two answers that you think of that you're probably trying to distinguish between. Okay. So which one do you guys think it is?
Inhalation.
So that's one of the answers that you probably are thinking about. True, there are definitely inhalation exposures in the home, like carbon monoxide and things like that. But actually the most common route of exposure is what?
Ingestion.
It's ingestion. Okay. Because, and you can kind of take a look at that rationale. Mostly though, if you think about children, right, particularly younger children, they put things in their mouth all the time. I mean, even if you just think about like chemical exposure, like a Tide Pod or something like that in your mouth, or like some other type of, even a pharmaceutical, right? Or even some other kind of detergent or something like that. So the most common route of exposure in the home is actually ingestion. Okay. Obviously there are examples of inhalation exposures. Like I mentioned, carbon monoxide being one of them, which are very serious, but they're just not more common than ingestion. Does that make sense? Okay. Right. They also give you a few other examples there too. All right. Water spill in the city and the water supply of 3 neighborhoods is contaminated. So what, which level do you think here?
Community level.
Anyone disagree?
Population?
Okay. So remember, it's 3 neighborhoods, but I agree. You would probably be thinking about, is it community? Is it population? Let's check community. Wait, super slow. It's community, right? Because again, only 3 neighborhoods are affected. When you think about population, it's going to be broader. Okay. So it wouldn't just be 3 neighborhoods. It would be, you know, much larger than that. All right. All right, and we definitely, I think I kind of referred you guys to a case study that was related to this. What do you guys think for this? So for the community, what is the transport media for the exposure?
Food.
How were the people exposed?
Water.
Okay, so be careful, right? Were the people exposed to the mercury by drinking the reservoir water, or how were they actually exposed to mercury?
All the food.
Yeah,
Food.
right? Because they're eating the fish, right? Remember, when we talk about mercury exposure, it's from ingesting and eating seafood or fish that are from a contaminated body of water. Okay. All right. Now, again, be careful because it's saying pregnant woman. So if I was going to ask you something like this, again, I would make sure that the questions are clear in terms of what I'm asking. Why do you have to be so loud? So what do you guys think here? So think about pregnant woman.
Isn't it D?
Referring this to her developing baby.
Isn't it
D?
A, teratogenic?
So again, we're describing exposure, right? So thinking about the route of that, how that exposure is being experienced. But I could see by your sort of would choose that.
D.
Yeah, D, because you're talking about passing on that chemical exposure to the developing fetus, right? And so what do we call that? Transplacental. Okay. Again, if I was going to get at this concept with you, this isn't the way I would ask the question. Okay. So just know, but again, these are questions that are NCLEX type questions. Okay. Like I said, for the exam, I'll ask you kind of similar. I'll word things similarly, but I'll make sure in terms of what the answer is, it's pretty clear what it will be. All right. So again, this is particularly, so you could probably, to be honest, there's definitely two answers here that I would be kind of like, it's either this one or this one. But in this chapter, I particularly talk about, the CDC and the, I think World Health Organization, but their sort of role in kind of monitoring environmental factors. So what do you think the answer is there?
C.
B.
Who else thinks B? Yeah, so the term for that is surveillance, right? And again, to be honest, if I had that same question on the exam and somebody picked epidemiology, I probably would take that too. But I would probably clarify to make sure you knew I was kind of asking for surveillance, okay? So it says they routinely collect data, right, to analyze growing trends in healthcare threat or disease development in order to plan and implement strategies for the prevention and control of adverse trends. So the idea of keeping track of where things are happening, and again, that is an epidemiological type of study, but in particular, sort of a sort of subsidiary or a sort of category underneath epidemiology is that idea of surveillance, right? Always looking to see, is there a certain area where this disease is more prevalent, and could it be due to some environmental factor, right, in that area, okay? All right. All right, so again, think about what a nurse, a public health nurse, would be doing or sort of collecting or assessing in an epidemiological study. Probably not going to be developing a vaccine, right? An epidemiological study. Probably not developing improved treatments. So what do you guys think for this one?
The risk factors?
Assessment of risk factors, good. All right, what about this one? I believe there is a question similar to this on the exam. So remember we talked about sentinel health events a little bit? So this is kind of a way to sort of apply that concept. So what do you guys think?
Is it C, the factory?
Why'd you choose that? I like C.
Because it has to do with a certain area and population, and it's in that specific factory.
Yeah, good. So again, remember how I said like, oh, I can't really like explain the sentinel health events too good, but I think this question helps really illustrate the concept well, right? The idea is to identify that health event, right, as a sentinel health event, because what can potentially happen if you kept letting this go or did nothing about it? Do you think there's going to be more cases of workers in that, or in that same town? Yeah, right. Likely, you can see how there's 7 instances of this rare type of cancer at, particularly in this town where you have this rayon factory. Likely something can be going on in terms of release of some sort of pollutant into that air, or maybe these 7 people work at that rayon factory, right? But there's something that's specifically tied there that then could potentially impact more people. Does that make sense to everyone? So that's the kind of idea of that sentinel health event. It's this sort of isolated event, but then has the potential of affecting other people, okay? And so important to identify those early on, right? Because if you don't, this 7 can turn into 70 really quick, right? More questions about that? right. I will, this will probably be the last one so we can move on to the last chapter, guys. What do you guys think about this one? Which part of the chain of infection, I don't even know that I ever said that, those terms. Anyway, describes a river that if, by the way, I will not ask you questions that I didn't go over in the recorded lectures, right? What do you guys think though?
D.
B.
D, was that two D's or that was a D and a B? D? Let's check it out. So maybe somebody said B. Right? So the answer is B. Again, I don't know that I use that terminology much, so I wouldn't be asking you a question like that. Okay. All right. I'm going to move on. Are we okay with moving on and away from this chapter? Okay. Any other questions, guys? Within this chapter, chapter 3? So one question I see here on my review sheet, vulnerable populations. So what's an example of a vulnerable population to essentially environmental factors?
Elderly.
Elderly. What's another one that we talked about?
Newborns.
Yep. What else? Newborns, and then we also talked about younger children too, right? That young population. And we kind of gave an example of why young like toddlers might be more vulnerable. They put stuff in their mouth all the time, right? But we also talked about physiological reasons as well. I know I asked you guys this before, right? That they have a higher metabolic rate. So there's physiological reasons why they're more vulnerable or more susceptible, right, to develop disease as a result of environmental exposure. Okay.
I just have a question about the vulnerable. Were adolescents one of them or no? Like that, like
I
don't
think
know.
maybe, I think so, because if you think about, I mean, adolescents, yeah, they were included in there. If you think about something particularly like lead or something like that, right, which could have an impact on cognition, right, or sort of brain development. In adolescence, you still have, ongoing brain development that's occurring, right? So if you had an exposure, it could then affect you. Whereas if you're talking about somebody my age, right, I'm old, there's not much plasticity and much brain development going on. So a lead exposure probably wouldn't affect me like it would in adolescence. So yeah, I think we consider them as well. Yeah, and still the higher metabolic rate too, right? Other questions, guys? All right. So the last chapter, chapter 4, right? Let me just pull up. Well, I have written down these figures here, right? 4.7, 4.8, and 4.9. So why don't we, what was it? I think I know which ones these are. Was this one of them that I mentioned? I guess we can kind of go over that. Yeah. Okay. So particularly, I started off at 4.7 there in the review sheet. This I went over this figure obviously in the recorded lecture. I guess there's a couple things I guess want to point out here, right? When we're looking at this, there's a lot of arrows going every which way. But there's a couple important, I guess there's more than a couple of things that are important, right? But the idea of this sort of this here. So how does personality fit into this, and why is it sort of feeding into appraisal, right? So here's your event, here's your stimulus, right? And then here's appraisal, and you have personality feeding into that too. So what's going on there? I guess, how would you sort of explain that? Or why do we show it that way? What do you think? What do we mean first by appraisal?
Is that like your perception of the event?
Yeah, good. I mean, that's the word I was thinking of too, right? We kind of, and I keep saying that word perception. It's you, yeah, going over what happened, right? And how are you then perceiving it based on, your sort of appraisal or your what's another word I can use there? Sort of analysis of what happened, right? Okay. So then how is that then influenced? Why do we have personality feeding into that?
Your personality and character traits are gonna affect the way you perceive something. Like,
Yeah.
this is a simple example. If you're generally a more happy person, something that might stress you out X amount would stress out someone who's maybe more negative a little bit more.
Yeah, good. I think that's a really good, sort of summary. And remember that, personality is obviously, or genetics are going to impact personality. I mean, obviously also there's social factors that would impact that as well, but part of that's genetic. But you're right, there's going to be this certain disposition that's then going to affect how you perceive, some sort of event. Okay, so the idea, and again, this is kind of showing you this transactional nature of stress. Once we kind of go through some of those review questions, there are a couple, I think, that kind of pertain to this transactional nature of stress, okay? But again, it's the idea of perception, right? If you perceive something as not being such a big deal, it's not going to activate all of these stress responses, right? If you perceive everything as such a big deal, well, you're going to be stressed out all the time, right? And you're always going to have this activation. And so that's where kind of this perception, personality comes into play. And then what about the coping part of it? How would you describe coping then? Because it's different than these things that we just talked about. What's an example, I guess, of coping?
Well, coping is like how you respond to the stress. So like someone might cope with it by drinking, or another person might cope with it by working out or talking to a friend.
Okay, good. I mean, right. It's some deliberate sort of action that you're taking to help you manage that, right? So remember that that's what the coping really is. It's sort of this deliberate action. I mean, in like animal models, if you study like depression and anxiety, I mean, one of the kind of there's this sort of learned helplessness kind of thing. I mean, that's kind of the idea where the animal to cope might just hide in the corner and not do anything, right? And so you can so you see this even in kind of simpler animal models as well. But for humans, obviously, it's a little more complex in terms of what types of coping can go on. But remember, it's deliberate, and it's kind of like that sort of response or what you're doing to kind of deal with it. Okay, all right. So let's move off there. Unless you guys have any more questions. I'm trying not to spend too much time. Okay. This is one of the figures that I said, hey, let's, make sure you kind of take another look at. And again, this is showing you what are some of the brain regions that are involved in interpreting stress. Again, you experience something, your sort of appraisal, right? We were just talking about the appraisal. We're talking about kind of personality. Well, these brain regions are are kind of part of that, right? And you can kind of see if we're talking about personality, then we're kind of focusing on frontal lobes there, okay? If you look at thalamus, this is sort of relaying any sensory information coming in. So you can kind of think about information sort of coming in, and then it's going to get relayed to the proper brain areas, okay? From there. How is the hypothalamus involved? Or when you think about hypothalamus, what sort of pathway what do you think about? Probably the next slide too, but. Right? This sort of beginning of this HPA axis over here, right? Hypothalamus. Now, hypothalamus is also involved in a lot of other things in terms of regulating sleep-wake cycles, regulating appetite, right? That's why a lot of these things are affected when you're experiencing stress, okay? But hypothalamus is also involved in controlling the entire endocrine system pretty much, right? And cortisol being the end result of this HPA axis, this pathway here, right? Cortisol is a hormone, okay? All right, so we'll come back to that in a second. What about amygdala? When you think of amygdala, you kind of associated it with one word. What would be that one word? I mean, it's written there. Fear, right? Emotion. Really, the amygdala is the sort of emotional regulator, okay? And then it's showing you pons, it's showing you brainstem there, influences sleep. There's other effects again of the brainstem as well. But the bottom line is these are some brain regions that are involved. There are many others in terms of interpreting stress, right? So that stimuli is going to occur. That information, that sensory information is going to come into that central nervous system. It's then going to get processed. And when you're processing it, that's you interpreting it or appraising that event. What are some of the brain regions that are involved? They're shown here, okay? Are there others? A lot of other ones too, okay? But you can kind of just go with this. Does that make sense in terms of what this is showing you guys? Anyone have any questions? All right, so I do expect, why is this cutting off? Oh wait, let me see if it's cutting off. Oh, I can see if it's cutting off the bottom. It is. I don't know why it's cutting off the bottom. All right, why do you guys, no, I expect you to know the details of these pathways here, okay? So when we're referring to the HPA axis, we should know what that is. If I ask you, what does the hypothalamus release, right, during the stress response, you should be able to tell me it's CRH. What is then the pituitary gland release? It's ACTH, okay? ACTH, its target is the adrenal gland. So the hypothalamus releases CRH just in this very kind of specific area, right, to the pituitary. ACTH, though, goes into the entire bloodstream. Its ultimate effector organ is the adrenal gland. It stimulates the adrenal gland to release cortisol. You should know those details, okay? And then if we look on this side, what do we sort of call this system here, or this pathway? What do we call this here? When we have release of norepinephrine, epinephrine. It's this, right, the increase in sympathetic activity, that fight or flight response, okay? It's saying LC here, locus coeruleus, norepinephrine pathway, because you can kind of think of that as being the brain region that's sort of going to initiate this, okay? But this is showing you the fight or flight, the increase in sympathetic activity, okay? The release of norepinephrine and epinephrine, all right? Questions about that, guys? I believe this was the other one that I referred to in the, 4.9, right? To just be familiar with some of these disorders, right? That can be sort of caused or sort of aggravated by stress there, okay? And I talked about anxiety and depression and mentioned like post-traumatic stress disorder, right? And also like acute stress disorder, okay? But there are other effects of stress. And again, we're probably aware of these. All right, anything you want me to anything else you want me to go over in chapter 4? Otherwise, I'm gonna end with finishing a few more of the questions from chapter 4. But class is over at 3:40, and unfortunately I have a meeting that already started at 3:30, so I'm gonna have to log off, okay? So maybe I'll kind of quickly go through them just so that you guys can see some more questions rather than spending more time explaining. But does anyone have any other questions from chapter 4 right now, or anything that you want further clarification? Everyone's good? We're okay? Okay, so let's just hit a couple more questions. Like I said, as I may just kind of like quickly go through a few more just so that you guys can see a few more if you want, okay? The other thing is I will be around campus tomorrow afternoon. So particularly I'll be done with lab around like 5 p.m. So if anyone has anything or any questions or anything like that, you can always stop by my office, or you can, send me an email or something like that, but I'm around tomorrow afternoon, okay? All right, so let's just take a quick look here. All right, so take a look at this question. Again, if you have to go back and watch this and kind of, look at them a little bit more, you can do that. That's why I'll kind of click through a couple here. So what do you guys think? So that we talked about this general adaptation syndrome, this model, right? About a kind of response to stress. And there's 3 stages. So which one do you think this is? What do you think? D is not one of the stages. So A, B, or C? I'm going to choose C. Okay, stage 2. So again, you can go back if you need to and kind of pause and read through that rationale a little bit more if necessary. All right, so I disagree with their answer here. So see what you guys think about this. What would you choose?
D.
Okay, who else would choose D? You guys like D? All right, well, so that is the correct answer, but I don't know that I necessarily agree with that. And you're talking about a high school student. Would you want to use the word anxiety? I don't know, right? It has definitely a negative connotation. And even though anxiety is a normal feeling, it's sort of perceived as being like, right? You think about anxiety disorder. I feel like your mind, or the high schooler's mind, might automatically go there. But anyway, that's the correct answer. Again, probably not a way I would ask the question. Okay. All right. Oh, what happened here? Oh, I don't know. I just have an X there. Okay, what do you think? So we're just talking about that transactional model of stress, right? What do you guys think? What was in that model, that picture we just looked at? Again, this is kind of, I don't know, kind of difficult to kind of choose the correct choice here. All right, I'm going to choose D. Just because I know it's the right answer. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, I would choose D anyway, but you can kind of see how all of these would affect it, right? But I think the idea is identifying if they're specifically talking about the transactional model, then it's going to focus more on the coping, okay? All right. Okay, what do you think about the sympathetic response? The purpose of it. What do you guys choose? Would you choose for
D
D?
or B?
Yeah, it's kind of like
I don't know, D.
kind of weird, but yeah, it wouldn't be B. What are you going to choose? What's your second choice? It's A. Again, not sure I love the way it's worded, okay? But just to kind of give you an example there. Again, focusing on the stimulus concept of stress, saying it's a protective response, okay? We can discuss that if we had time, but all right, next one. All right, what do you think about this one? So I think this is not something that's an initial sort of response. This is something like more down the line. Okay, you might be inclined to choose coping maybe, but again, remember, kind of think of coping as kind of being more closer to the event. Whereas this is really showing that the person has adapted, right? And is kind of going one step further with it. All right, so here's a question that's getting at, do you know the HPA axis, that pathway? So what would be the right answer here? Do you agree it's either A or B?
Would it be A?
Why would you choose A? So does ACTH stimulate the release of CRH?
Doesn't.
No, it would be B. I
Yeah,
think it would
stimulate.
be the other way around. I
Yeah,
read that.
B. Yeah, so be careful. But so CRH, right, is released by the hypothalamus. That's kind of what's going to start it. And then that then stimulates the pituitary, remember, to release ACTH, right? ACTH then stimulates the release of cortisol. Okay, good. All right, so this is kind of like a very similar question, right? So nurse recognizes that a dysfunction of the pituitary gland would likely have dysregulation of the release of which hormone? So which hormone is released by the pituitary?
Adrenal.
ACTH.
ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. Good. All right, couple more minutes. I'll try to get to 10. I don't know, my computer's going slow now too. If you have to log off because you have class or something, feel free to log off. I'm just gonna try to get through a couple more, and then I'll post this recording right as soon as it's available. Okay, guys? Oh, did it go? All right, what do you got here? Amygdala. What do you think? Can you feed the dog me?
A.
I would choose A. Remember we talked about the amygdala, right, as being involved in emotion. Particularly one of the emotions we associate with the amygdala is fear. All right. This is a weird question, by the way. I don't know. What are you going to choose here? The way this is worded and the answer choices are very, they're not great. I don't even know which one to choose, just so you guys know. So brain tumor near the hypothalamus. The client reports increased anxiety due to the stress of the diagnosis. Based on the client's stress response and current condition, which clinical manifestation might the nurse find? What would you guys choose? Just pick one. What do you think?
I would put B.
Which one?
B.
Sorry, now I got sneeze. Oh my goodness. Would you say D or B?
G.
B.
D, B?
Yeah.
That's the correct answer. I kind of had a little, I don't know, a few issues with the way it's worded, but yeah, good. Oh my goodness. Don't worry, he'll be done in a second. All right. 1 second. Me, first of all, go. We're gonna fall. Go. There couldn't be any more noise. It's impossible that it could be more. All right, what do you guys think? What do you guys think? What are you going to pick for this one?
Would it be A or B?
I agree that it's either A or B.
I think B would be the answer because it has the gastric acid.
Yeah. Good. I would choose B. I mean, obviously there's complicated sort of effects, right, on the GI system in terms of stress, because it could definitely cause increased motility, right, or cause diarrhea or something like that, but it could also cause constipation. So it does kind of depend, but I agree that B is the best answer there. All right. All right, last one. All right, so this is good. The distinction between acute stress disorder and PTSD.
Would it be B?
I agree that it's B, right? Because what are they going to find out? They're going to find out when those symptoms started in relation to that event, right? Remember, acute stress disorder, those flashbacks and things like that are going to happen closer to the event and maybe not last very long. But with PTSD, they may show up much later. All right, guys, that is it. I got to go to the meeting. Let me know if you have other questions. Like I said, I'm around later tomorrow. Tutor is available. So whatever you guys need, okay? Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.